Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Moonlit Library, your home for all things smutty story time. If you are joining us for the first time, thank you so much. We're so happy to have you here. And if you are returning to us from week 1 or 2, honestly, you are honoring me so much by just letting me read these amazing stories to you. I am so thrilled that you are enjoying it, and I hope that you will love our next book just as much as I do. As you may have noticed, we kicked off with a really, really dark romance with Salah Gothic, and then we returned to the sort of rom-com-y roots that just make your heart happy. And now we are going back to something kind of right in the middle of that. It's still very dark romance, it's still very taboo romance, but it's definitely something that will make your heart a little bit happy after it takes your heart right on through the caves. It is a phenomenal book, and honestly, this book kind of inspired this channel. When I read through it, I absolutely fell in love with every aspect of it, and I knew that more people needed to be aware of it. And I also knew that it's really hard for new baby debut authors to get the word out on their stories. And that's the reason that you see so many Instagram sponsored ads and things like that. And so I knew I wanted to promote this book as much as I humanly could. And I tried to figure out what the best way to do that was. Was it, just posting about it on my Instagram? Was it, just throwing copies at people? Which I have done both of these things, by the way. I'm completely proud of that fact. But I knew that there was a larger, more global way to do that. And alas, the Moonlit Library was born because if there was even one book like this, then there had to be more. And I have been lucky enough to find a bunch of really amazing indie authors who are willing to work with me to let me read the first few chapters of their books so that y'all can hear them and get exposed to them. Word choice, isn't it great? And maybe fall in love with their stories just like I did, because I know that not everybody has the opportunity to read these through Kindle Unlimited or hear them through Audible. So I figured, let's bring the party to you. And this was in large part due to the book that we're reading this week. And this book also has a really special place in my heart, as does its author. I received an ARC copy of this book back in November, I think, and I just fell in love with the story. It's dark romance at its heart, it's taboo, it's romantic suspense, and it is really Southern Gothic in a way I just absolutely did not expect. I found it because of the works in progress that the author was posting to Instagram, and honestly, the works in progress took my breath away. And I would find myself kind of low key stalking her Instagram over and over, trying to hear more of this story. And so when it came time to submit for ARCs, I did. I was lucky enough to get chosen, and I fell in love with the story so, so hard. And then provided completely unsolicited feedback, not in the form of a review, but through DMs. And this author was lovely enough to not completely shut down the unsolicited feedback. She was absolutely wonderful. And after that, she became a close friend. And so I am absolutely thrilled, 1000% thrilled, to introduce this week's story, which is The Thief and the Painter by my girl Candice Clark. I will buy almost any book in hard copy. It's a problem. I'm starting to run out of shelf space. However, I instantly had to go and buy a hard copy of this book because it is phenomenal. I have actually brought it here today in our weird church like smut scenario. That makes sense. And I would love to show it to you because it's stunning. So this is The Thief and the Painter, and the reason that I bring it up, not just because like it's so pretty, but is also because Candice actually designed this cover. It is stunning, and it really embodies that feeling of the book and that feeling of darkness and overwhelming and just being haunted by ghosts. Figurative, not literal. So without further ado, we're going to actually read the summary. Let's open our hymnals to the summary, and then we'll kick it off with the first 3 chapters. Amelia. Paint smudges and secret grudges. Despite the occasional ball gown and glass of champagne, my life is anything but glitz and glamour. I'm the daughter of the Southern Black Widow, a girl so full of darkness that bleeds from my very fingers onto high-priced canvas. But what is darkness but the absence of light? Insert Merrick Stratford, my light. His cold demeanor doesn't fool me. Every time my eyes find his, they're already on me. They're always on me. But he's my stepbrother, and propriety dictates that he's off limits. Or is he? Merrick. Flashy cars and hidden scars. To the upper crust of Charleston society, I'm a sought-after bachelor, an entrepreneur and philanthropist. But behind closed doors, I'm a thief, the son of a con man, and singularly focused on obtaining the one thing I can't steal. Amelia Caro. Her demons are mine to slay. Hell, I've been doing it since we were teenagers. But I'm no white knight. I'm simply biding my time, doing the necessary recon to pull off the greatest heist I've ever attempted. What's that saying? If you want something badly enough, you have to reach out and take it? Well, I'm taking it. That's our summary. Isn't it absolutely incredible? It's just makes my heart happy. We are going to drive right into our book and kick off with one of the most important parts of this book, because it does actually cover a lot of territory that can get really dark. So we're going to dive in with the content warning. This book contains dark subject matter that may be triggering to some. It is intended for mature readers only. Please review the list below and consider these carefully before continuing. Your mental health matters. Murder on page. Sexual assault on page, not between MCs. Child abuse on page. Domestic abuse mentioned, not between MCs. Somnophilia, dubcon. Stalking, anxiety. Depression and thoughts of suicide. Alcohol, prescription drug use. So obviously that does cover a lot of really dark ground, and dubcon, I know for some gets really, really close to non-con. That's not necessarily the case in this book. It's actually beautifully done, because of course it is. It's Candice. But I do want you all to be aware of your mental health and what your potential triggers are. Within the first couple of chapters, we don't get that far into the items that necessitate the content warning, but if you do choose to pick up this book, please be cautious, please be alert to these various triggers. We want to make sure that you are in a safe place mentally for the read. And now we're going to kick off with the acknowledgement. Fate lines are twisted with surprises. There is a critical moment in this book when the main male character hears those words. Like him, I have to believe that it was fate that led me to the indie book community. Fate that led me to the many wonderful friends that believed in my ability to do this, even when I couldn't even fathom it myself. This book is for them as much as it's for me. Without them, these characters and the world they live in wouldn't exist. They would never have become real people to me, as I hope they'll become real people to you. So, thank you. Thank you, Yvette. Thank you, Lindy. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Ari. And thank you to everyone else who boosted me up and supported me during this process. A process that's burned a good number of brain cells, but that's okay. I didn't have many to begin with. XOXO, Candice. Now that we have dug in on those content warnings, please, please, please pay attention to those. It's okay to stop if you need to. And the acknowledgement, we're going to kick off with the prologue and 2 chapters of our story. Prologue. Merrick, 13 years old. People were so fucking gullible. A little bump, a slight graze, or an innocently distracting smile was all it took. In the hour I'd been wandering around the Battery, I'd already lifted 3 wallets. The sum total of cash I'd collected didn't amount to much. Did no one carry cash anymore? All I'd gotten was a measly $27, but that was 3 or 4 meals for me, which was more than I'd had in the last week. It's not like I could count on my father to provide me with basic necessities, like food, shelter, and clothing. Peter Stratford didn't do anything for anyone unless there was some benefit in it for him, not even for his own son. The truth was, my father was a bum, and worse than that, a drunk. And when he drank, he got mean. Hell, he wasn't the nicest guy when he was sober, come to think of it. But at least when he was sober, I didn't have to choose between finding a place to hide out or becoming his punching bag for the night. In my short 13 years of life, I'd had more injuries than I could count. What started as pushing and the occasional backhand had become bruises that could no longer be covered, and repeated trips to the ER. Dad always had a cover story ready for the doctors, though. If there was one thing my father was good at, it was bullshitting people. He'd turn on the charm and showcase his smarmy grin, and they'd eat his shit up and probably ask for seconds. At least it worked with most people, especially the ladies. Unfortunately for the both of us, it hadn't worked so well with the teachers at my last school. After noticing a pattern of injuries, the teachers notified the district, who then contacted social services. Faster than it took to blink, I was pulled from public school, and he began homeschooling. I use that term as loosely as possible. He'd basically found a homeschooling association that allowed him to pay a fee, turn in quarterly reports on my progress, and call it a day. In actuality, he wasn't teaching me squat. And since I was no longer in school and getting free lunch, I got 1 meal a day at best. Many days I just went hungry. At first, I hadn't been keen on turning to a life of petty theft, but considering when not drunk off his ass, my father was the very definition of a smooth criminal, I guess it ran in the blood. God, I hoped that was all I'd inherited from the man. Well, that and my dark hair. With the inky black strands, I was a miniature version of my father. I'd once heard a woman compare him to a fallen angel. What a joke. More like the devil. Either way, considering my genetics, I guess it made perfect sense for me to be out here robbing people blind. I'd been picking pockets and running petty scams since I was 10. Having smaller hands and nimble fingers often came in handy. Whether it was switching cards during a game of 3-card Monte, or swiping a wallet from a loose back pocket, I had always had a penchant for taking things that didn't belong to me. Whenever I had the occasional flare-up of conscience, I just reminded myself that no money equaled no food. I did what I had to do to survive. Most of the time, I didn't feel guilty about it. My marks were almost always walking around in designer clothes, name-brand shoes, and flashing expensive-looking jewelry. So no, I didn't often feel bad. What I did feel was envy. Here I was risking life and limb for scraps, and they were walking around with Rolexes on their wrists. I wasn't stupid enough to believe that running away from home would solve my problems, though. As much as I'd like to be free of my sorry excuse for father, I knew I'd be worse off on the street. There were far scarier things out there. A punch I could take, but some of the other things I'd witnessed in the darker alleyways of Charleston, I couldn't. So for now, I did the best I could to get by. But I swore to myself that one day I'd have everything I deserved and more. Always more. Because once you had a taste of nothing, you could never accept less. One day, I'd be someone to be envied, someone important. The minute I turned legal, I'd get as far away from Peter Stratford as possible, and I'd never look back. No ties, no emotional attachments. I'd be my own man, and I'd make a name for myself. As I watch a couple walk by, obviously coming from some glitzy event, the woman decked out in diamonds, a thought occurs to me. Yeah, I'd make a name for myself. Hell, maybe I'd make several. Chapter 1. Amelia. If rumors were to be believed, this entire city was haunted. That was typical of southern towns as steeped in rich history and as covered in blood as Charleston, South Carolina. I didn't mind the ghosts, though. Over the years, they'd become companions to the shadows that followed me everywhere I went. From a young age, I'd heard and seen more than the average child, even when compared to other children raised within the upper crust of Charleston society. Having a mother with the reputation of being a black widow will do that to a kid. But now, it seemed as an adult, the sins of the mother were fated to become muses for the daughter. My ghosts manifested themselves in the form of art. The sketches and paintings hung and stacked upon themselves within my studio wouldn't be out of place on the walls of some dreary Gothic castle. In reality, they most likely ended up the conversation piece of some stuffy party, where high-priced champagne and trysts in shadowy corners went hand in hand with cigar smoke and the trading of stock tips. I knew my paintings had been purchased by buyers from all over the world, but the darkness splashed across my canvases still lent to a reputation as somewhat of an oddball, even in the eccentric circles of the southern upper class. While I could put on a ball gown and mingle with the best of society when the occasion called for it, I was honestly more at home in a cemetery or wandering around downtown Charleston long after the partygoers that usually littered the streets had gone to bed. For them, sunset was when the city really came alive. For me, I'd take those few precious hours after all the fun, but before the sun came up, when everything settled to an eerie silence. In truth, I'd spent most of my life in the dark. I knew that embracing the nightmares that flashed behind my eyes, then releasing them onto a tightly pulled piece of cloth, wasn't a healthy coping mechanism. My best friend Siren often told me that I needed therapy. Or Jesus. I suppose I'd better start praying, because my mother would never allow a shrink to get up close and personal with my demons, and it wasn't for fear of me saying something that might incriminate her. She just wouldn't be able to handle the embarrassment. The shame of having a daughter whose issues couldn't be quelled by several glasses of wine and Xanax. You just didn't do therapy when your peers spent their days sipping sweet tea and blessing people's hearts, and their nights sleeping with other people's husbands. This lifestyle often led to the complete and total nervous breakdown of what was once a belle with a life to be envied. One whose existence was now reduced to long vacations at the old family plantation in the country, and whispers behind delicate hands that sported manicures to rival even the deadliest of monsters. To avoid suffering a similar fate, I chose to channel my childhood traumas in a way that kept my mother placated and money in my pocket. My money, not family money. I didn't want a dime of the fortune my mother had spent a lifetime amassing, first on her back, then on the dotted line of a life insurance policy. Or should she say policies? In my short 24 years, I'd been a Caro, a Winston, a Prescott, a Michelson, and a Stratford. Each stepfather came and went in the blink of an eye, not via a divorce attorney, but in a very tasteful casket. Appearances had to be maintained, after all. Husband number 5 seemed to be sticking, though. I wasn't sure if it was because he and my mother were a perfect match in both tastes and temperament, or if it was due to the fact that Peter Stratford had turned out to be a con artist of the highest caliber. I was sure my mother would rather be stuck in an unwanted marriage than admit that the man she herself had conned into holy matrimony shortly into my teenage years had been conning her right back. Peter and my mother seemed to have been cut from the same cloth, albeit cloth with two very different price tags. My mother was a killer dressed in silk and pearls. Peter was a con man and a violent drunk, but only behind closed doors where he could always make sure the bruises and scars could be easily hidden from the world beneath the designer clothing my mother so preferred. Luckily for Suzanne Stratford, she had still been riding on the coattails of her last husband's will when she found out that her new husband was flat broke. They were a match made in hell. In fact, the only good thing that seemed to accompany stepfather number 5 was Merrick. Merrick. Just thinking about him made my heart stutter a little. When my mother took the plunge again shortly after my 15th birthday, I had expected to have to feign love for another aloof father figure. What I hadn't anticipated was for that father figure to be accompanied by a freshly turned 17-year-old son. I'd like to say that at 17, Merrick had been your typical rebellious youth with more mouth than sense. But even then, there were shadows in his eyes that told of dark deeds and barely healed wounds. It wasn't long before I learned the hard way that his stoic demeanor and tightly leashed rage were simply byproducts of his environment. At 17, Merrick had seemed to be on the cusp of something, whether great or terrible, I hadn't been sure. Now at 26, he was one of Charleston's youngest entrepreneurs and philanthropists, though I believed that most of our social circle considered him a trust fund baby. To the outside world, a sophisticated and charismatic bachelor. They had no idea that his father had entered the marriage to my mother as part of a scam because he was broke. Even now, I had no idea how Merrick made his money. To me, he was a fountain of secrets and cold indifference, which I guessed was only fair considering I did my best to keep the terror that made up the darkest parts of my soul hidden from prying eyes. Even his. Which explained why I was currently sitting alone in a cemetery at midnight. While that in itself wouldn't be out of the norm for me, the surrounding streets seemed unusually quiet tonight. It was a Friday after all, and Friday nights in Charleston, even at midnight, would usually be filled with raucous, barely legals stumbling down the street after exiting some bar they managed to con their way into with a fake ID. Or I'd be hearing the crackling of a loudspeaker for one of the guided ghost tours coming to an end. But not tonight. The weather was already sweltering, and it was only late April, but that too wasn't unusual for the South. I liked to make jokes that we lived in the prettiest part of the armpit of the United States. My mother, however, didn't find that amusing. She would attempt to lecture me on being a proper young lady. I was anything but proper. My outward appearance was a direct contrast to the trauma in my past and the art I created. Maybe it was because of those things that my wardrobe looked like a color factory explosion. I loved tie-dyes, neons, and jewel tones, the latter of which were my favorite because they tended to complement my deep green eyes. My hair was a mass of auburn curls that leaned more towards strawberry blonde than the true copper red I wished I'd been born with. 9 times out of 10, you'd find them tossed up in a messy bun at the top of my head. Natural curls and southern humidity did not mix. I also had a bad habit of accidentally painting my long locks when I wasn't paying attention. When I felt the urge to paint, nothing else around me existed. It was almost as if I'd entered a trance of sorts. All of my inner turmoil, stress, anxiety, and fear would pour out of me and onto the canvas. Whenever I finished a painting session, I almost felt purged, my soul a tiny bit lighter and a little less black. When I wasn't actively painting, I was sketching. Siren often likened me to a monster, having crawled my way out of the muddy swamps because my fingertips were constantly stained black from the charcoal I favored. I'd usually just laugh those jokes off, though. It was easier than dredging up the facts that both Siren and I knew that monsters were real. We'd lived with them for years. I was probably one of the only people on the planet who knew that Siren had a shaded past all her own, and knew what lay underneath all those pretty tattoos on her back. Scars of the physical, mental, and emotional variety. A text chime suddenly jolts me out of my inner musings, the noise ridiculously loud in the too quiet night. I usually put my phone on silent when I visited the cemetery. I didn't like to disturb the dead, and while I didn't mind the ghosts, I also didn't need any more than the ones I carried with me every day. Just as I reach into the pocket of my oversized linen overalls, the text sound chimes again. Cringing inwardly, I quickly silence the phone before looking at the display. Speak of the devil, and she shall appear. At least electronically. Bitch, are you asleep? Siren. I know you're not asleep. I'm watching you right now. JK. But seriously, I bet you're out lurking around town. If you are, text me. I'm so bored. Siren. Smiling, I shake my head ruefully. Siren was always bored. Of the two of us, she was definitely the more outgoing one, the extrovert to my introvert. While I was perfectly content to hole up in my studio, elbow deep in paint, Siren was forever thinking about her next set of plans. I was sure it was a form of rebellion to combat years of suppression and abuse. How she'd kept that abuse hidden for so long, I still didn't know. We'd been best friends since childhood, from the day we'd met in second grade when I'd been getting teased for my frizzy hair, and in retaliation, she'd convinced Tiffany Wilson that she was adopted. We'd been inseparable. Tiffany wasn't adopted, as far as I knew, but it didn't take much to make an 8-year-old cry. Siren probably knew more about me than anyone. She knew the ins and outs of my personality, my favorite foods, my favorite hobbies. But she didn't know what made me tick, because despite how close we were, I feared that if I was to let her into my brain, she'd never make it out again. So over the years, I told her the bare minimum, for her own protection and because she was already dealing with enough shit of her own. It was the parts of me she did know that made her able to predict that I wasn't currently in bed. Hello, opposite me. You're right, I'm not asleep, I'm at St. Philip's. Me. OMFG, you're in the graveyard at night again? I swear you're a member of the undead. Siren. Sometimes it feels like it, lol. And stop ragging me, it's peaceful here. Me. You can't even sketch at this time of night. Come out with me. We can hit up Prohibition, find some hotties, and let them convince us to go back to their place. Siren. Prohibition will be closing in 2 hours. Besides, I'm getting ready to head home. I've got an early meeting with my agent. Me. That wasn't a lie. I did in fact have a meeting with my agent. He'd called to let me know that there was some issue with my latest painting. The majority of my art was held in a gallery in downtown Charleston. It was showcased there, available for sale to anyone who happened to wander into the gallery, but most of the pieces were also listed on my website. The gallery sales were handled by the broker there, and the website sales were handled by my agent. I would normally put him off. I wasn't big on the business end of the art world, if I was honest with myself. I actually hated selling my work. Nearly everything I painted felt like an extension of me, so when it came time to sell, it was almost as if I was giving away a part of myself. Buyers could speculate all they wanted as to the inspiration for my art, but only I knew the truth, and that was that the darkness that bled onto the canvas most of the time I sat down to paint were scenes from my nightmares. Except a lot of those nightmares weren't actually nightmares, but memories pulled from the deep recesses of my mind. And almost all of those bad memories could be traced back to my mother. Even thinking about her now causes a knot of anxiety to form in the pit of my stomach. Despite the rumors surrounding my mother's previous marriages, some of which I had a disturbing amount of insight into, our relationship had always straddled the fine line between life and death without actually tipping over. Any time we were together, a threat hung heavy in the air. I wasn't sure what stopped her, especially knowing that I was privy to some of the darkest parts of her. I knew it wasn't love or even affection. My mother had always been detached and cold. How I turned out to have any semblance of empathy for others, I had no idea. Fine, go make your millions. Just don't forget us little people when you move out of this shithole town and become famous. Siren. First of all, I'm sure I'll never be famous. Secondly, I don't want to move out of this shithole town, as you say. I like it here. It has character. Me. You'll never be famous? Remind me again how much your last painting sold for? Siren. She was goading me. I knew she was. This was a common bit between the two of us. I'd downplay my accomplishments, and she'd remind me how much talent I had and what I could do with it. Siren was the ultimate hype person, which came in handy when you had a family that was constantly talking down their noses or shitting all over you. Outside of my mother, my stepfather was, well, He was a bastard. Plain and simple. Then there was Merrick. Despite his demeanor of general irritation whenever I was around, he was still the closest thing I'd had to family, which made the crush I'd harbored for him since I was 15 very inconvenient. In my mind, I knew we weren't related by blood, so the idea of something happening between us didn't skeeve me out. I may have, in fact, entertained a fantasy or 500 about what it might be like if Merrick ever let his iron control slip and saw me as a woman, not just his annoying little stepsister, but I wasn't a fool. Even without the barrier of our de facto familial relationship, Merrick absolutely refused to recognize the possibility that there was a single sexual bone in my body. If, by some miracle of God, he ever did, the gossip mongers of the city would have a field day with two step siblings fooling around with each other. I had a feeling a scandal like that would finally push my mother over that fine line. Bringing myself back to the present, I realize I haven't responded to Siren's last text. I don't know, darling. I haven't a head for numbers. Imagine me saying that in the most posh British accent I can muster and waving my hand in the air like a queen. Me. A likely excuse, although that visual will stay with me for a long time. Imagine you, my little tie-dyed corpse bride, being a member of the British upper class. God, I'm so glad you're not like one of those vapid airheads your mother runs around with. Siren. The very idea of my mother running around with anyone was laughable. My mother and Siren had a love-hate relationship, as in, Siren loved to hate my mother. I was positive my mother returned the sentiment. Of course, she would never say it outright. She'd just make it glaringly obvious by her resting bitch face and the thinly veiled snide remarks that she wielded like daggers. Suzanne was anything if not civilized, even with people she disliked. It made it easier for her to wield the knife if you trusted her enough to give her your back. Siren and I exchange a few more texts, not regarding my mother, thank God, and then end our conversation with the promise of girls' night tomorrow night. Exiting the cemetery, I walk the short distance back to my townhouse. I lived in downtown Charleston, and anyone would tell you that everything within downtown Charleston was within walking distance of everything else. Besides being a city full of rich history, it was also a college town. At any given moment, the streets were littered with students walking from here to there. Of course, I did have my own car, but there was just something about wandering the cobblestone streets, especially at night, that helped clear my head. At 24, I lived on my own, so I wasn't beholden to anyone else's schedule. I ate when I wanted, slept when I wanted, and painted when I wanted. More often than not, the latter would have me neglecting the former. But that was the life of an artist. When the muses struck, you were compelled to see it through, or in my case, to purge. It was the selling of that art that allowed me to be able to afford my own home, car, and the lifestyle to come and go as I pleased. I was an independent woman. Despite the horrors I'd seen growing up, I tried my best not to let it affect my day to day. I tried to keep a positive outlook on life. Maybe that was because I'd seen firsthand how fragile that life was, or maybe it was because I was determined to rebel against the idea that I'd inherited my mother's penchant for being a bitter old shrew. Whatever it was, it spurred me to be kind to everyone I met, regardless of social status. Just as I began dipping my toe into the pool of introspection, I realize I'm already standing in front of the wrought iron gate that surrounds my home. My townhouse sat smack dab in the middle of historical downtown, with its black fence wrapping all the way around the property and the landscaped yard full of greenery and flowers that seemed to have burst free overnight. My home was pretty enough to be featured on a postcard. In fact, it probably was. Every weekend, the market would be teeming with booths full of art and photography featuring picturesque Charleston homes just like mine. With its traditional white painted siding and tall staircase leading up the front door, it was definitely worthy of being the focus of any tourist's camera. I took pride in my home, and I loved every square foot of space because it was my space. But nearly every one of my waking hours was spent in the little outbuilding adjacent to the house, my studio. My little jaunt in the cemetery, combined with the unexpected impending sense of doom that had set in at the call from my agent earlier, had me going straight inside and changing into an old t-shirt and shorts and heading right back out again. Regardless of what time I had to be up in the morning, I knew I'd spend the next several hours in my studio releasing all the pent-up tension and nerves swirling inside me. Chapter 2. Merrick. There was a fine sheen of sweat dotting my forehead, and I prayed that I'd be out of here before that sheen had the chance to turn into drops. The last thing I needed was to start sweating my ass off and leave behind forensic evidence that would allow the FBI to finally put a face to the name the Black Knight, a moniker that had become synonymous with a number of high-profile thefts. Everything from priceless jewels to million-dollar paintings. According to Reputation, there was nothing the Black Knight couldn't steal. Oh, how wrong they were. While it was true that almost any material possession, regardless of protection or security, could be mine, there was one thing that I'd desperately wanted for years that I'd yet to acquire. My own version of the Hope Diamond, or in this case, maybe Emerald would be more accurate. Unfortunately, it wasn't so easy to steal something that lived and breathed. It was true that I frequently operated within the space of morally gray, but what I craved was something that I knew I couldn't just take. I had to earn it. Growing up, I'd spent countless days worrying about when I'd get my next meal. As a kid, out of necessity, I'd turned petty crimes to sustain the pesky habit of wanting to eat 3 meals a day. Within a year, picking pockets had evolved into lifting watches and jewelry. I was good at it. It only made sense considering it was in my blood. You see, living under the thumb of a man like Peter Stratford, I'd never had anything of my own, nothing that was really mine. Then one day, right after my 17th birthday, I had an epiphany. I realized that in order to have the life I truly wanted, I would need to make myself into someone better. Someone with money, influence, and power. Because it was on that fateful day that I saw something that I knew I had to call my own. Something that I didn't want to have to share with anyone. Something that was mine. That was the day I met Amelia Caro. At 15, she'd been a gangly teen with frizzy hair, a smile that was a little too bright, and eyes that held an ocean of secrets. Looking into those eyes had felt like drowning, and it was then I'd realized air was overrated. In the beginning, it had been obsession at first sight, but over the years, when other emotions, volatile emotions, came into play, I finally got a true grasp on what I was feeling. Love. It had always been love. I just didn't recognize it for what it was. To mask my shock at having been struck dumb by a girl for the first time in my life, I'd come across a little too cold, a little too uninviting. Her too bright smile had dimmed a fraction, and I'd felt like the biggest shit on the planet. I mean, it wasn't her fault that every time she looked at me, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Well, maybe it was, but I knew it wasn't intentional. Over time, I'd come to learn that Amelia was the most kind-hearted person I'd ever met. Something else I wasn't used to. Given her young age and the fact that I knew both of our parents would try to use the information of my infatuation as leverage in their own sick games, I vowed to myself then and there that I'd keep a tight leash on my emotions until I could figure out a way to get our parents out of the picture. Over the years, God knew I'd tried to contain my feelings. There may have been a time or two when the line I'd drawn in the sand had blurred a little, but I always found a way to talk myself back from it. In the meantime, I'd honed my skills as a thief and amassed the wealth, power, and respect that I not only thought would make me worthy of her, but that would allow me to protect her. Over the years, the jobs I'd taken on had become more dangerous and highly publicized, but with great risk came great reward. I was now a self-made millionaire. Most of the things I stole, I sold through my longtime fence, Deacon. Being similar in age, we'd developed a friendship. He was the only person who knew both my moniker and my real name. Coming from his own humble beginnings, and with a past riddled with tragedy, we'd bonded in a way that I didn't think was standard practice for a thief and their fence. Somehow he'd become my best friend, and a lifeline I'd held on to more than once to keep myself afloat. However, at this present moment, I was contemplating Deacon's murder. If it wasn't for a tip from one of his sources, I wouldn't be in this Manhattan high-rise sweating my ass off trying to crack this guard-all safe. It wasn't the safe itself that was causing my current level of perspiration, though. It was the fact that there was no fucking air conditioning in this apartment. In researching this job, I found out that the owners of this loft were what's referred to as snowbirds, meaning they spent half the year here and half the year somewhere else, depending on the weather in each location. And of course, when they weren't staying here, the utilities were shut off, a fact that Deacon's source had conveniently forgotten to mention. So here I was, in a black turtleneck, ski cap, leather gloves, and pants, sweating my balls off. I swore when I got out of here I was going to choke Deacon to death with my garrote. Well, after he fenced what was inside this safe. 3 agonizing minutes that felt like hours later, and I was in. Opening the safe, I did a quick sweep of the contents. Lots of cash, several leather-bound books that appeared to be ledgers of some kind, and 4 red leather boxes. I wouldn't be touching the cash or the books. My sights were set on what was inside those boxes. Gently removing the first, I quickly opened it to reveal a stunning diamond choker with a massive teardrop ruby in the center. The second, third, and fourth boxes confirmed that the entire Cartier set was present and accounted for. Slipping them into the sling bag attached to my back, I quickly closed the safe before making my way out of the condo via a flight of service stairs at the end of the building's hallway. There were cameras in the hallway and stairwell, but Deacon had already hacked into the system and overridden them so that Rodney, the overnight security guard at the front desk, would see nothing out of the ordinary. The video would play on a loop until shift change in the morning. By the time they realized there was something wrong with the feed, I'd be long gone, and the jewels would be on the other side of the globe in the hands of their new owner. Contrary to popular belief, I hadn't chosen the moniker of the Black Knight. In fact, despite my younger self's plans, I made absolutely sure that no calling card of any kind was left behind when I targeted a mark. It made it harder to compile a list of charges if the police couldn't link any of your crimes together. Regardless, I'd been given the nickname, and a fair number of notorious thefts had been laid at my doorstep, garnering me a reputation in both the underworld of criminals I had the misfortune of dealing with, as well as in the eyes of the law. It didn't bother me. I was sure there were far worse things the media could have dubbed me. At least this name lent to an air of mystery and danger, which of course just ratcheted up my ego. As a kid, I'd been a bruised, half-starved, miserable little prick. As a teenager, I'd been quick to temper and rebellious to a fault. Now, as an adult, I was alternating ice and fire encased in armor, dual sides of my personality, both of which I needed in order to run in the higher circles of Charleston society. As much as I hated having to fake civility and rub shoulders with the same snobs that had once turned their backs on the kid version of me begging on the streets, I couldn't wait to get back to the city. I wanted to see Amelia. I might be in a different state, but I always knew what she was up to at any given time. I had eyes and ears everywhere. Thanks to those eyes and ears, I knew Amelia had an early morning meeting with her agent tomorrow. There was no way I'd be missing that. The guy was a sleaze. Oh, sure, to outward appearances he seemed to be the epitome of sophistication. Smooth and charming. But on the few occasions I'd had the misfortune of being in the same room with him, I didn't miss how his eyes roved over Amelia's form, despite the fact that the man was married with 2 kids. Knowing that, it wouldn't surprise Deacon one bit to find out that I'd opted to fly back home tonight instead of tomorrow as originally planned. Don't get me wrong, Amelia could handle herself. She was strong, stronger than any other woman I'd ever met. But from the first moment I'd laid eyes on her, her demons had become my demons, even if she didn't know it. And while I'd never be of the white variety, this night wouldn't let her fight all her battles alone. After exiting the building and blending in with the pedestrians littering the busy New York streets, I pull out my phone and hit Deacon's name in my contact list. He answers on the 4th ring. Because he's busy? No. Because he knows I hate waiting, and he wants to be an asshole. So of course I tell him that the moment he picks up. Yo bro, any hitches in the program? Deacon says by way of greeting. You're an asshole, I reply without preamble. I can hear the smile tugging at his lips when he answers. Now, is that any way to talk to your bestie? I thought we were still in the honeymoon phase of our relationship, and you were supposed to be kissing my ass. I've known you for 11 years. The magic is gone. In fact, I'm seriously considering filing for a divorce. Whether I take you for alimony is going to hinge on your answer to my next question, I say in a biting tone. The silence hangs heavy in the air, and I give him a minute to squirm before I continue. Deadly as a rattlesnake, I ask. Did you, or did you not, know that there was no fucking air conditioning in that apartment? Deacon bursts out laughing, breaking the tension I'd worked so hard to build. Sorry, dude. I just assumed that since you almost always have boiling lava simmering in your veins, you wouldn't notice if the room was a little warm. Oh, don't worry. I'm gonna have an outlet to spew all that boiling lava onto in about an hour, I reply through clenched teeth. I don't know why you're so upset. I've seen you work in far less comfortable situations. Remember that time you had to break into that palace vault owned by the Sheik of... Fuck, I can't even remember, and steal that ring he'd given his late wife when they got married? You know, before she realized that he was a piece of shit? I did remember that job. That was one of my most publicized heists. The wife that Deacon was referencing had been one of Hollywood's top leading ladies at the time. The Sheik had come in, swept her off her feet, and she'd basically given up everything to be with him. Then he made her life a living hell. The ring in question had been her engagement ring, which had been splashed on the cover of every magazine and newspaper in the world at the time. It had all been for show, of course. Behind closed doors, he was evil incarnate. She'd later committed suicide. I wasn't sad to see the piece go when Deacon had sold it off. Jewels like that had a way of carrying ghosts with them. Totally changing the subject without answering, I say, I'll meet you at the designated location for the handoff in 1 hour. Agreeing, we disconnect. An hour later, I make the drop, handing the jewels over to Deacon, while making sure to give him an in-person ass-chewing over the air conditioning situation. During the time that all this is taking place, my private jet is being fueled up and ready for takeoff, with me having called ahead to tell them to be ready within the hour. I'd need to shower and get a few hours of sleep before showing up unexpectedly at the gallery, where the majority of Amelia's work was showcased, and where she'd most likely be meeting Mr. I'm I-fucking you at all times. She wouldn't thank me for the unexpected appearance, but I didn't give a shit. Someone had to look out for her, and I'd be damned if I let that someone be anyone other than me. During the roughly 2-hour flight back to Charleston, I couldn't keep my mind from wandering back to the day my life was changed irrevocably, and the world had tipped on its axis. To this day, and to my constant surprise, it still hasn't righted itself. It didn't bother me, though. I just learned to look at everything from a different perspective. So that was the first 3 chapters of The Thief and the Painter, which is the first book in Candice's Thick as Thieves series, and it really sets up the world, because anytime you have a series that's getting built, you actually do have to do rather a lot of world building in the front, even if it's not paranormal romance or romantasy or anything that requires an alternate world. You still have to do some world building to set up the expectations and the parameters of the scenario in which you're finding yourself. And that's a lot of exposition. And it's really up to the author whether that exposition feels clunky or whether it feels natural. And Candice is a phenomenal author in that she made sure that we feel a melody to that sort of exposition. There's a flow and there's a musical nature to it almost. And you see that really especially in Mia's chapters specifically, because Mia is all about the art of life. Mia is all about the canvas of life, not to torture this metaphor too much. And it is really, really stunning to hear her talk about the world and the ghosts of Charleston and how she doesn't need any more ghosts. She doesn't mind them, but she doesn't need any more of them. And I'll be honest, that, while I can't think of the exact phrase off the top of my head, it does sort of sit in my brain every time I read it, because there's just something about the execution of that phrasing that is absolutely stunning and just really resonates in a way that you don't see a lot of. Because a lot of the times when you get these sort of metaphors and figurative speech and musical musing, really specifically, within a book, it gets to be cumbersome and it gets really purple, I think is the phrase that I've heard used to describe it most frequently, which means that it's really kind of florid and overwhelming. And so a phrase like that, and I'll pull the actual phrase for you because I am nothing if not overly thorough and I need to respond to our notes. So the actual phrase here is, I didn't like to disturb the dead, and while I didn't mind the ghosts, I also didn't need any more than the ones I carried with me every day. I don't know why that phrase gets me as deeply in the feels as it does. There may be just something about the synchronicity of it. It sort of bounces back and forth really beautifully. Or, and it could also be this, it may be both, let's be real. It could be that it feels so true to the lived experience. Everybody carries their experiences with them through life. That's the very nature of being a person. You carry your memories and your lived experiences with you. And so if those experiences are bad, they are haunting in their own way. They're ghostly in their own way. And it's something really beautiful to recognize that you have your own ghosts, not necessarily in a paranormal perspective, but in a traumatic perspective. And I just really love how it's that meshing of this emotional ghost versus the paranormal ghosts. It's just a really beautiful phrasing that you don't hear a lot. You don't hear these two things paralleled. And that really embodies that musical aspect, that artist aspect of Mia. And then you have Merrick, who, by the way, is my ultimate book boyfriend. He has lived in my head 1,000% rent free since I've read this book back in November, and I have loved him since then, if we're being really real. To the extent that I have actually already purchased a candle that Candice solicited. She actually worked with a company to make candles based upon the scents for each of these characters. And Merrick's candle smells like, I call it raunchy citrus, but in actuality, I think it's supposed to smell like Russian tea, which is a cinnamon and orange type mix. But to me, it will always be raunchy citrus, because that also feels like it really aligns with the smut-tastic value of this book. Because Candice's smut and spice writing is quality. I will tell you, that is actually what drew me to this book in the first place, because Candice would post little chunks of her work so far for The Thief and the Painter before she published it. And I stumbled across it on Instagram. I don't even remember how, but the spice was what got me first. And then once I read the story, I found out just how much I loved that the plot was not just dark romance. There's actually an element of suspense built into this plotline. Part of the appeal of The Thief and the Painter is the fact that it is 1,000% a taboo romance. It is a romance between two step siblings who have had to, in some form or fashion, lean on each other for the course of their lives because they're the only ones that each other has. He's morally great AF. I don't know how to say it other than that. We know exactly how he's going to respond to things when it pertains to Mia. Everywhere else, who knows? He could land on the good side of the spectrum, he could land on the bad side of the spectrum, who knows? It really is up to chance. However, when it comes to Mia, we know exactly where he'll land, and that's really sexy and really intense. And that is, honestly, Merrick's character in a nutshell. Sexy, intense, and utterly ridiculous. So if y'all are feeling a mystery, spicy, step sibling taboo romance with like some light bullying and some definite stalker vibes, give The Thief and the Painter a shot. She is actually writing the second book in the series right now, and you can go find her work in progress posts on Instagram. She is at What the Smuts, and I put that in the caption as well, just so y'all can go check her out. And she is really lining up, and this is not a surprise, nor is it a spoiler, because she has actually already announced this, Deacon and Siren's book. I cannot wait. I cannot wait for their story. I am so impatient for it. But if you are at all intrigued, please go read The Thief and the Painter. It is on Amazon, and Candice also has a What the Smut Etsy page as well, where you can get a special edition version of The Thief and the Painter, as well as the paperback copy, like I have, which, so pretty, so pretty. And you can also get book boxes where she has little tchotchkes and gifts in addition to the book itself. Plus, you can also get that Merrick candle if you too want to smell some raunchy citrus that will make you think of everybody's favorite book boyfriend. So please go read it. It's absolutely incredible and 1,000% worth the read. And go check it out before our second book, which is called The Fence and the Musician, I think. Yeah. So just verified, it is called The Fence and the Musician. If you are interested in the rest of The Thief and the Painter, please go check it out. So if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and check out our first two if you haven't watched them already. I will return on Wednesday. I actually already have our next author lined up, and she is super excited to be featured for next week, and I cannot wait to introduce you to our rom-com stalker.